They banned it to stop the rituals. Now it's a billion-dollar industry. Hey guys, tonight we're talking about the most controversial substance in human history, one that was sacred for 9,000 years, banned for 50, and is now being prescribed by psychiatrists in Australia. Here's the thing nobody tells you in school. Humans have been eating brain-altering mushrooms since before they invented the wheel, writing, or pants. A fungus that grows out of cow dung has, at various points in history, been called the flesh of God, a weapon of the CIA, the secret fuel of Silicon Valley, and the most promising antidepressant of the 21st century. The same mushroom that an Aztec priest ate in a stone temple in 1400 AD is now being consumed by a software engineer in San Francisco who just wants to hit his quarterly targets. Nothing about this story makes sense, and yet every single part of it is true. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel if you enjoy these stories. Write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I always find it fascinating to see people from around the world united by one story. Now, let's go back to the beginning, not the 1960s. That's where most people start and most people are wrong. The real beginning is a cave in the Sahara desert, roughly 9,000 years ago, where someone with no language, no government, and no concept of Tuesday decided to paint mushrooms on a rock wall. The cave is called Tassili Naja, located in what is now southeastern Algeria. It is one of the most remarkable archaeological sites on Earth, a sandstone plateau covered in thousands of prehistoric rock paintings depicting animals, humans, and rituals spanning at least 10,000 years of continuous occupation. Most of the paintings show what you'd expect: hunting scenes, cattle, human figures dancing. But a specific group of images, estimated to be between 7,000 and 9,000 years old, show something that stopped researchers cold when they first examined them in the 20th century. The figures in these paintings are human-shaped, but wrong in a specific way. They have mushrooms growing from their bodies. Some figures hold mushrooms in their hands while lines radiate outward from their heads, the universal ancient visual language for altered consciousness or divine contact. One particular image shows a beheaded figure covered in mushrooms, surrounded by smaller mushroom shapes floating in the air around it. Archaeologists call this style round head art, referring to the distinctive circular heads drawn on the figures. What they couldn't call it for a long time was drug use, because that interpretation was too uncomfortable for academic institutions in the mid-20th century. French archaeologist Henri Lotte documented Tassili Naja in the 1950s and brought it to international attention. He was cautious in his interpretations, others were not. Ethnobotanist Giorgio Samarini later argued specifically that several of the Tassili figures depicted ritualistic use of psychoactive mushrooms, making this the oldest known visual evidence of humans intentionally consuming mind-altering fungi. Not 900 years old, not 950, 9,000. That number deserves a moment. 9,000 years ago, the Sahara was not a desert. It was green, a vast savanna crossed by rivers, dotted with lakes, populated by hippos, crocodiles, and enormous herds of cattle. The people who lived there were not primitive grunting creatures dragging clubs. They were sophisticated pastoralists who tracked stars, managed livestock, and apparently held ceremonies involving substances that made them see things that weren't there. Whether those things were divine or neurological depends entirely on who you ask. The uncomfortable question is not whether they use psychedelic mushrooms. The rock art makes that hard to dispute. The uncomfortable question is why. And this is where the story gets strange in a way that science still hasn't fully resolved. In 1992, an ethnobotanist, author, and professional provocateur named Terence McKenna published a book called Food of the Gods. In it, he advanced what became known as the stoned ape theory. The proposition that psilocybin mushrooms were not merely something early humans happened to eat, but a significant driver of human cognitive evolution itself. The argument ran like this: as the African climate shifted and forests receded, early hominids began following cattle herds across open grassland. Cattle dung is a perfect growing substrate for Psilocybe cubensis, the most common psychedelic mushroom species on Earth. Early humans, foraging opportunistically, would have eaten these mushrooms. At low doses, psilocybin demonstrably enhances visual acuity and pattern recognition, an obvious survival advantage for a creature hunting prey on open savanna. At medium doses, it increases energy and libido. At higher doses, it produces synesthesia, hallucination, and the sense of contact with an intelligence larger than oneself. McKenna argued that repeated consumption of psilocybin over generations contributed to the rapid expansion of the human brain, the development of language, and the emergence of religious consciousness, the capacity to conceive of gods, spirits, and invisible forces shaping reality. He called psilocybin the original tree of knowledge. The mainstream scientific establishment received this theory the way it receives most unconventional ideas, with polite dismissal followed by increasing irritation as the theory refused to die. Critics pointed out that McKenna offered no fossil evidence, no genetic proof, and no mechanism by which chemical exposure could produce heritable cognitive changes within an evolutionary time frame. They were right about the evidence gap. The problem was that McKenna was asking a question nobody else was asking, about a phenomenon nobody else was explaining: the sudden, apparently rapid expansion of human cognitive capacity roughly 70 to 100,000 years ago, what researchers call the cognitive revolution, or behavioral modernity, cave art, symbolic thinking, burial rituals, musical instruments, all appearing in the archaeological record with a speed that, by evolutionary standards, borders on explosive. The conventional explanation involves genetic mutations affecting brain wiring, climate pressure forcing innovation, and the gradual accumulation of cultural knowledge. These explanations are reasonable. They are also, to anyone who has thought carefully about the timeline, somewhat incomplete. The stoned ape theory doesn't fill that gap with certainty, but it sits in the gap like a splinter, small, irritating, and impossible to simply remove. What the theory correctly identifies, regardless of its larger claims, is something archaeologists don't dispute. Humans have been seeking altered states of consciousness deliberately, intentionally, and consistently across every culture and every period of recorded history. There is no known human society that did not develop some method of altering consciousness: fermented beverages, plant medicines, rhythmic drumming, fasting, or hyperventilation. The desire to get outside ordinary reality appears to be, in some fundamental sense, a human constant. And in many of those societies, the method of choice was a small brown mushroom growing out of the ground. What makes the Tassili painting so striking is not just their age, it's what they suggest about intention. The figures are not accidentally eating mushrooms in the way a cow might eat them. They are posed in what every scholar of ritual art recognizes as ceremonial postures. The mushrooms are rendered carefully, prominently, with what appears to be reverence. Someone 9,000 years ago decided that the experience these fungi produced was important enough to record on stone, important enough to spend hours carving into rock under the Saharan sun, in images that would survive every empire, every religion, and every attempt by civilization to rewrite the story of what humans are. The question of why they did this leads directly to what happened next. In a civilization far more powerful, far more organized, and far more deliberate in its use of the mushroom than any cave-dwelling pastoralist on a Saharan plateau. Because roughly 7,000 years after those paintings were made, Somewhere in the highlands of central Mexico, a priest in an elaborate feathered headdress was preparing a ceramic bowl filled with mushrooms for a ceremony that would determine the fate of an empire. And the mushroom's role in human history was about to become something far more complicated than a cave painting could express. The Aztec Empire at its peak was not a loose collection of tribes wearing feathers and painting their faces. It was a state of roughly 5 million people, with a capital city, Tenochtitlan, larger than any city in Europe at the time. It had courts, taxes, an astronomical calendar of staggering precision, mandatory education, and a military that had conquered most of central Mexico through a combination of tactical brilliance and calculated terror. This was a civilization that understood power deeply, wielded it deliberately, and embedded it in every layer of daily life, including its religion. And at the center of that religion, hidden inside its most sacred ceremonies, was a small brown mushroom. The Aztecs called it Teonanacatl. The word breaks down cleanly in Nahuatl. Teo means divine or sacred. Nanacatl means mushroom, flesh of the gods. Not mushroom that makes you feel good. Not mushroom that helps you relax. Flesh of the gods. The naming alone tells you everything about what they thought was happening when a person ate one. These were not recreational objects. The distinction matters enormously, because every modern instinct is to map the Aztec use of psilocybin onto something familiar. A party drug, a spiritual supplement, a meditation aid. None of those categories fit. Teonanacatl occupied a position in Aztec society closer to what the Catholic Eucharist occupies in Christian theology, a physical substance that, when consumed under the correct ritual conditions, produced direct, unmediated contact with divinity. Except unlike the Eucharist, it actually did something measurable to the brain. The ceremonies involving Teonanacatl were documented, however reluctantly, by Spanish missionaries who arrived in the early 16th century and found themselves witnessing things they had no framework to process. The Franciscan friar Bernardino de Sahagún spent decades in New Spain compiling what became the Florentine Codex, a 12-volume ethnographic encyclopedia of Aztec life, assembled through interviews with indigenous informants. His descriptions of Teonanacatl ceremonies are clinical in their detail, which makes them all the more disturbing to read. The mushrooms were consumed at night, after periods of ritual fasting. Participants ate them with honey to mask the bitter taste. Within 30 minutes the visions began, described by Sahagún's informants as encounters with gods, demons, animals, and ancestral spirits. Some participants wept, some danced, some remained motionless for hours, apparently receiving messages from entities they described as more real than anything in waking life. When the effects faded near dawn, priests would gather and interpret what had been experienced. The ceremony was not entertainment, it was governance by other means. This is the part of the Aztec story that rarely gets told in full. Teonanacatl was not just for priests and mystics. It was an instrument of political decision-making at the highest levels of the state. Aztec rulers consumed mushrooms before major military campaigns to receive divine authorization for war. War councils incorporated mushroom ceremonies as a form of collective intelligence gathering, or, depending on your perspective, collective hallucination calibrated toward consensus. Death rites for Aztec nobility included mushrooms administered to the living witnesses of the ceremony, not just as grief management, but as a mechanism for collective witness of the soul's departure. The coronation of Aztec Emperor Moctezuma II in 1502, the same ruler who would later receive Hernán Cortés, was reportedly accompanied by a ceremony involving Teonanacatl. The logic was explicit. A new ruler needed divine confirmation of his legitimacy, and divine confirmation required the flesh of the gods. Power in the Aztec world was not purely secular, it was cosmological, and cosmological access required the mushroom. What the Spanish found when they arrived in 1519 was therefore not a primitive superstition they could easily dismiss. It was a sophisticated theological system backed by institutional power, centuries of accumulated ritual knowledge, and an empirical understanding of plant pharmacology that European medicine would not formally rediscover for another 4 centuries. The conquistadors understood none of this. What they saw was people eating fungus and claiming to speak with gods, and that was, to the Catholic mind of the 16th century, the definition of demonic possession. The Church's response was not gradual, it was systematic and ferocious. The Inquisition targeted neonatal use with the same intensity it brought to heresy in Europe. Indigenous people caught participating in mushroom ceremonies were flogged, imprisoned, and occasionally executed. Missionaries burned the painted codices, the Aztec books that documented ritual practices in extraordinary detail, in public bonfires that destroyed centuries of pharmacological and ceremonial knowledge in an afternoon. Of the hundreds of codices that existed before the conquest, fewer than 20 survived. The ones that mentioned Teonanacatl were specifically targeted. What the Spanish couldn't burn, they attempted to rename. Catholic priests began calling the mushroom carne del diablo, flesh of the devil, as a deliberate inversion of the Aztec name. Flesh of the gods became flesh of the devil by colonial decree. The same substance, the same chemical, the same neurological event, rebranded entirely through the power of institutional language. This was not merely religious zealotry. It was a calculated act of cultural erasure, because the Spanish understood, even without the vocabulary of pharmacology or neuroscience, that the mushroom was a source of authority independent of the Church. You cannot convert a population that has direct access to its own gods. The mushroom had to go. But here is what the Inquisition could not accomplish. Despite 300 years of trying, it could not make the mushroom stop growing. Psilocybe species are extraordinarily resilient organisms. They grow in cow pastures, on forest floors, on decaying wood, in the cracks of stone walls. They require no cultivation, no irrigation, no particular climate management. The same qualities that made them available to prehistoric humans on the Saharan savanna made them impossible to eradicate in the mountains of Oaxaca. You can burn a codex. You cannot burn a mycelium network running 3 feet underground through the roots of an oak tree. So the knowledge went underground instead. Not metaphorically, literally. Indigenous healers in the mountains of Oaxaca, Guerrero, and Chiapas maintained the ceremonial use of mushrooms in secret, passing the knowledge from healer to healer across generations, deliberately never writing it down, never speaking of it openly in the presence of outsiders. The ceremonies became invisible to colonial authority. The mushroom was folded into Catholic imagery as camouflage. Ceremonies held on saints' days, mushrooms referred to in code, the whole practice wrapped in a surface layer of Christian iconography that satisfied priests conducting inspections while leaving the core ritual entirely intact. This survival strategy was not unique to psilocybin. Across the colonized world, indigenous practices survived colonial suppression through exactly this kind of adaptive concealment. But the mushroom's case is particularly striking because the concealment lasted so long and so completely. For 400 years, from roughly 1520 to the 1950s, the Western world had essentially no idea that active mushroom ceremonies still existed in Mexico. European and American scientists and anthropologists had classified Teonanacatl as a historical artifact, a feature of pre-Columbian civilization that had been successfully extinguished. They were wrong. And the person who discovered just how wrong they were was not an anthropologist, not a botanist, not a missionary, and not a government agent. He was a banker from New York who spent his weekends thinking about mushrooms. Robert Gordon Wasson was, by every visible measure, the least likely person to detonate a cultural explosion. He wore three-piece suits. He worked at J.P. Morgan, eventually rising to vice president. He had a wife, a comfortable Manhattan apartment, and the kind of a life that proceeds in an orderly fashion toward a respectable obituary. The only unusual thing about him, the single detail that distinguished him from 10,000 other mid-century American bankers, was an obsessive, decades-long fascination with mushrooms. It had started on his honeymoon in 1927, when his Russian-born wife Valentina spotted wild mushrooms in the Catskill Mountains and rushed to collect them with a joy that Wasson found completely baffling. He had grown up in the Anglo-Saxon tradition that regarded mushrooms with suspicion bordering on disgust. You didn't eat things that grew in the dirt and rotted quickly and sometimes killed you. Valentina grew up in a Slavic tradition where mushrooms were sacred, celebrated, and deeply embedded in culinary and folk culture. The couple spent the next 25 years investigating why different cultures across the world had such radically opposite relationships with fungi, eventually developing the concept of mycophilia versus mycophobia, mushroom-loving versus mushroom-fearing cultures, and tracing the divide across continents and centuries. This research led them, eventually, to a specific and electrifying piece of evidence: scattered references in colonial-era Spanish documents to a mushroom cult in Mexico that had supposedly been extinguished by the Inquisition. Other researchers had noticed these references and concluded the practice was dead. Wasson looked at the same evidence and concluded it was worth checking. In 1953 he travelled to Oaxaca for the first time, asking questions in villages about mushroom use. The walls he hit were immediate and total. Locals either denied any knowledge or gave him information so vague it was useless. He returned in 1954 with better contacts and more patience. He returned again in 1955 with a name: the village of Huautla de Jimenez, high in the Sierra Mazateca mountains, and the name of a curandera, a healer, who was said to practice the old ceremonies. Her name was Maria Sabina. What happened when Wasson finally reached Huautla de Jimenez in June of 1955 was the result of years of careful relationship building with local intermediaries, combined with an extraordinary act of trust on Maria Sabina's part that she would later describe as the worst decision of her life. After considerable negotiation, she agreed to allow Wasson and his photographer companion Alan Richardson to participate in a velada, a night-long healing ceremony centered on the consumption of sacred mushrooms. They would not merely observe, they would participate, they would eat the mushrooms. Wasson was 55 years old. He had no history of drug use. He had no particular spiritual practice. He sat in a candlelit room in a mountain village with no electricity and ate mushrooms prepared by a Mazatec healer. And what happened to him in the following hours shattered whatever framework he'd brought with him to understand the world. He later described encountering visions of such architectural grandeur and emotional force that his ordinary vocabulary failed entirely. He wrote of geometric patterns of impossible complexity, of a sense of presence that felt more ancient than anything human, of the complete dissolution of his sense of being a separate observer, the feeling, as he put it, of being absorbed into something vast. He was not a mystical man. He was a banker. The experience hit him like a freight train made of light. He spent 2 years deciding what to do with what he had experienced and what he had witnessed. The result was a 15-page article published in Life magazine on May 13, 1957, under the headline "Seeking the Magic Mushroom." The article was illustrated with photographs, written in vivid and accessible prose, and placed in one of the most widely read publications in America at a moment when America was hungry for exactly this kind of story. Strange, exotic, spiritually suggestive, and slightly dangerous. 9 million people read it in 1957. Before the internet, before social media, before the concept of going viral existed as a phrase, the impact was immediate and in several directions simultaneously catastrophic. Within months of publication, a stream of American and European seekers began making their way to Huautla de Jimenez. Young people mostly, who had read Wasson's article and wanted the same experience. Within a year it was a flood. The village, which had no tourism infrastructure, no hotels, no restaurants capable of serving outsiders, was overwhelmed. Maria Sabina, a woman who had spent her life in quiet, difficult service to her community as a healer, found strangers appearing at her door at all hours, demanding access to the ceremony she had shared with one banker in a moment of trust. She had not been given a choice about the article's publication. Wasson had not asked her permission before writing about her or photographing her ceremony. The concept of informed consent did not apply. She did not speak English, had no access to American media, and had no way of knowing what a 15-page spread in Life magazine would mean for her village or her life. By the time she understood what had been set in motion, it was already irreversible. The Mexican government, embarrassed by the international attention drawn to indigenous drug use, began harassing her. Local authorities, resenting the flood of foreign visitors and the chaos they brought, blamed her personally for the disruption. Her house was burned down at least once. 2 of her children died violently in the years following the article's publication, in circumstances that her community attributed directly to the consequences of Wasson's visit. She spent the last years of her life in poverty, largely abandoned by the outside world that had briefly made her famous, telling anyone who asked that the mushrooms had lost their power because they had been profaned, shared with people who came for curiosity rather than healing. Wasson, for his part, spent the rest of his life increasingly horrified by what he had unleashed. He published extensively on mushroom use in ancient cultures, helped identify the specific species involved as psilocybe mexicana and related species, and cooperated with Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann, the man who had synthesized LSD, in obtaining samples that Hofmann used to isolate and identify the active compound, which he named psilocybin in 1958. Wasson genuinely believed he was advancing human knowledge. He was not wrong. He was also not entirely right about the consequences. Because among the 9 million people who read his Life article in 1957, a significant number had institutional affiliations that had nothing to do with spiritual seeking. One reader was a Harvard professor named Timothy Leary, who at the time was a relatively conventional psychologist studying personality assessment. He would not read the article seriously until 1960, when a colleague handed it to him during a trip to Mexico. By that point, Wasson's article had already reached another reader whose interest was far less philosophical, a reader whose organization had been running covert experiments on mind control since 1953, and had just found what looked like a very interesting new research subject. The CIA had come to Oaxaca. The Cold War had a specific kind of paranoia that is difficult to fully appreciate from a distance of 70 years. It was not the vague, generalized anxiety of people who know something bad might happen. It was the sharp, operational fear of people who believed the enemy had already developed weapons that worked invisibly, weapons that didn't destroy buildings but destroyed minds. By the early 1950s, American intelligence had watched Soviet and Chinese interrogators extract detailed, apparently voluntary confessions from captured soldiers and political prisoners, and the question consuming the CIA's most senior officials was not whether brainwashing was real. It was whether America was losing the race to perfect it. This fear produced Project MKUltra, authorized in April 1953 by CIA Director Allen Dulles, funded through dummy foundations to conceal its government origins, and run by a chemist named Sidney Gottlieb, who approached the project with the methodical enthusiasm of a man convinced he was saving Western civilization. MKUltra's mandate was broad to the point of being almost unlimited. Find chemical, biological, and psychological methods to control human behavior, extract information from unwilling subjects, and potentially create operatives whose actions could be programmed and later made inaccessible to conscious memory. The program ran for 20 years. It involved at least 80 institutions, including universities, hospitals, and prisons. Most of its subjects never knew they were part of an experiment. LSD had been MKUltra's primary chemical interest since 1953, when Gottlieb's team obtained a large supply from Sandoz Pharmaceuticals in Switzerland and began a testing program of extraordinary recklessness. CIA officers dosed each other at parties to see what would happen. They dosed mental patients, prisoners, and sex workers in safe houses in San Francisco and New York, watching through one-way mirrors and taking notes. One agency employee, Frank Olson, was dosed without his knowledge in 1953 and died 9 days later, after falling from a New York hotel window. A death officially ruled a suicide that his family spent the next 50 years arguing was something else entirely. By 1957, when Wasson's article appeared in Life, MKUltra was already 4 years old and deeply invested in psychedelic compounds as behavioral tools. Psilocybin was a natural next step. The CIA dispatched an agent named James Moore, a chemist at the University of Delaware with conveniently fungible academic credentials, to accompany Wasson on his 1956 return trip to Oaxaca. Wasson believed Moore was simply a scientist interested in mycology. Moore was there to obtain mushroom samples for Gottlieb's program. He succeeded, returning with specimens that were passed to Hoffmann in Switzerland, where the active compound was isolated, giving MKUltra a synthesizable, controllable version of what had previously only existed in a fungus growing on a Mexican mountainside. The CIA's interest in psilocybin was grimly practical. Where LSD had proven too unpredictable, subjects sometimes became violent, sometimes catatonic, sometimes laughed for 6 hours, making it useless as a precision tool. Psilocybin appeared to produce a more consistent state of emotional openness and reduce psychological defensiveness. The agency explored whether it could be used to extract confessions from enemy agents, to destabilize the mental functioning of foreign leaders, or to produce states of suggestibility in which subjects would accept implanted beliefs or instructions. These experiments were conducted on prisoners at the Federal Penitentiary in Atlanta, on patients at psychiatric hospitals, and on volunteers who were told they were participating in studies of experimental medicine, which was technically true in the way that describing a car crash as experimental physics is technically true. What the CIA discovered, and what it found profoundly inconvenient, was that psilocybin didn't make people more controllable. It made them less controllable. Subjects under psilocybin became emotionally volatile, philosophically expansive, and deeply resistant to external authority, not because the drug made them aggressive, but because it temporarily dissolved the psychological structures through which authority normally operated. The inner voice that says, "I should do what I'm told," requires a functioning ego to deliver that message. Psilocybin at sufficient doses dismantles the ego with the thoroughness of a professional demolition crew. Gottlieb's program eventually abandoned psilocybin as operationally useless for its intended purposes. What it left behind, however, was a network of researchers who had been funded, trained, and given access to the compound, and some of whom had developed ideas about its potential that went far beyond the CIA's narrow behavioral objectives. The most consequential of these researchers was not on the CIA payroll at all. He had arrived at psilocybin through an entirely different door, and by the time the agency was writing off the compound as unworkable, he was already convinced it was the most important discovery in the history of psychology. Timothy Leary in 1960 was 39 years old, recently divorced, and by his own later admission, professionally bored with the kind of psychology he'd been practicing. Personality questionnaires, statistical analysis, careful academic prose that changed nobody's mind about anything. A colleague handed him Wasson's article in Cuernavaca, Mexico, where Leary had gone for the summer. 2 weeks later, sitting by a swimming pool, he ate 7 psilocybe mexicana mushrooms obtained from a local contact. What happened in the following hours was, by his own account, the psychological equivalent of being disassembled and reassembled as a slightly different person. He later claimed to have learned more about the mind in those 5 hours than in his previous 15 years as a psychologist. Allowing for the considerable discount one should apply to Timothy Leary's self-reporting, the experience was clearly something that altered his trajectory with the permanence of a geological event. He returned to Harvard in the fall and immediately established the Harvard Psilocybin Project, using synthesized psilocybin obtained legally from Sandoz Pharmaceuticals through appropriate academic channels. The project's early work was genuinely rigorous by the standards of its time. The Concord prison experiment tested whether psilocybin-assisted therapy could reduce recidivism in released prisoners, and initial results suggested it could, though the methodology was later criticized. The Marsh Chapel experiment gave psilocybin to divinity students during a Good Friday service, and found that the majority reported profound mystical experiences indistinguishable from the spontaneous religious experiences described in theological literature, a result so clean and so strange that it made the front pages of Boston newspapers. But Leary was constitutionally incapable of staying within institutional boundaries. His research increasingly blurred the line between scientific experimentation and personal evangelism. He began giving psilocybin to friends, artists, and intellectuals outside formal research protocols. He brought Aldous Huxley into the project, the author of Brave New World, who'd been interested in psychedelics since his mescaline experiments in the early 1950s, and who deeply disagreed with Leary's instinct to share the experience as widely as possible. Huxley believed psychedelics should be administered carefully to selected individuals as a tool for cultural and intellectual transformation from the top down. Leary believed everyone should have access immediately. This disagreement was not merely tactical. It was a fundamental argument about who gets to decide which doors of consciousness open, and when, and for whom. Harvard fired Leary in 1963, citing failure to meet teaching obligations and violations of research protocols. His colleague Richard Alpert, later known as Ram Dass, was fired the same day for giving psilocybin to an undergraduate student. The academic chapter closed. The cultural chapter exploded open. Leary spent the next decade as the most famous and most controversial figure in American counterculture, declaring psilocybin and LSD tools of liberation, coining phrases that became generational anthems, and drawing the focused hostility of the Nixon administration, which declared him the most dangerous man in America. Nixon's characterization was hyperbolic but not entirely without logic. Leary wasn't dangerous because he took drugs. He was dangerous because he told millions of people that the authorities controlling their access to their own consciousness had no legitimate right to do so. The government responded in 1970 with the Controlled Substances Act, which placed psilocybin in Schedule 1, the most restrictive category, reserved for substances with no accepted medical use and high potential for abuse. The scheduling was not based on clinical data. No comprehensive safety review was conducted. The classification was, in the assessment of many researchers who examined it later, primarily a political act, a mechanism to associate the counterculture with criminality and provide legal tools to prosecute its participants. Scientific research on psilocybin stopped almost completely. University programs closed. Pharmaceutical companies abandoned their investigations. The compound that a New York banker had pulled out of a 400-year colonial silence in 1955 was now locked behind a legal wall so thick that even proposing a research study required years of regulatory navigation and institutional courage that most scientists weren't willing to risk their careers on. The mushroom had survived the Inquisition. It had survived the conquistadors. It had survived 4 centuries of colonial suppression in the mountains of Oaxaca. Now it had to survive the United States government. The 1970 Controlled Substances Act did something its authors almost certainly did not intend. By making psilocybin illegal, the government removed it from laboratories, universities, and pharmaceutical companies, the only institutions with the resources to study it carefully and the authority to distribute it responsibly. What it could not do was remove the mushroom from the ground, and it could not remove the knowledge of the mushroom from the minds of the people who had already encountered it. What happened next was not organized resistance. It was something more organic and, in the long run, more durable. The counterculture that Leary had helped create did not dissolve when Nixon signed the Controlled Substances Act. It dispersed, scattering across rural America into communes and college towns and the dense urban neighborhoods of San Francisco and New York, carrying with it a body of experiential knowledge about psychedelics that no legislative act could confiscate. Among the people carrying that knowledge was a young man from Colorado named Terence McKenna, whose name had appeared briefly in part 1 of this story, but whose full significance only becomes clear now, because McKenna, along with his brother Dennis, was about to do something that would change the geography of psilocybin use permanently. In 1976, the McKenna brothers published a slim, unpretentious manual titled Psilocybin, Magic Mushroom Grower's Guide, released under the pseudonyms Otios and Oenioric, a thin legal shield that fooled nobody who was paying attention, but provided just enough deniability in an era before internet metadata. The book contained detailed step-by-step instructions for cultivating Psilocybe cubensis at home, using materials available at any hardware store or garden supply outlet. Brown rice flour, vermiculite, mason jars, a pressure cooker, and a spray bottle. The total cost of setup was roughly $30. The technical skill required was approximately equivalent to making bread. This was not a minor development. This was the democratization of psilocybin production. Before the McKenna manual, obtaining mushrooms required either living near a natural habitat where they grew wild, specific fields and forests, predominantly in the American Southeast, Pacific Northwest, and Gulf Coast, or maintaining connections to the underground distribution networks that had survived from the 1960s. Both options required either geographical luck or social access. The manual eliminated both barriers simultaneously. Anyone with a kitchen, $30, and the ability to read could now grow their own supply indefinitely. The book spread through underground networks in the way that genuinely useful information always spreads when authority tries to suppress it, relentlessly, invisibly, and with a speed proportional to the intensity of the suppression. Photocopied pages circulated in college dormitories. Mail-order spore suppliers appeared, operating legally in most states because psilocybin spores contain no psilocybin. The compound only develops during the growth process, a botanical fact that created a legal grey area so wide you could drive a truck through it. The truck, in this metaphor, was driven by an increasingly large community of home cultivators who shared techniques, troubleshot problems, and exchanged spore samples through a network that operated with the quiet efficiency of a postal service dedicated entirely to fungi. By the early 1980s, this community had developed cultivation techniques significantly more sophisticated than anything in the original McKenna manual. Indoor growing substrates were optimized, contamination protocols were refined, new species, Psilocybe cyanescens, Psilocybe azurescens, Psilocybe tamponensis, were identified, cultivated and distributed through networks that existed entirely outside legal visibility. The mushroom was not merely surviving prohibition. It was thriving under it, spreading to environments and populations it had never previously reached, carried by a distributed network of enthusiasts who had no central leadership, no headquarters, and no manifesto. The contrast with the pre-1970 situation was almost absurd. When psilocybin was a legal research compound, it was available only in university laboratories to credentialed scientists working under institutional oversight. A decade after criminalization, it was growing in mason jars in apartments across North America, Europe, and Australia. Terence McKenna himself became the underground's most articulate voice during this period, not as a drug advocate in the Leary sense, shouting liberation rhetoric at government officials, but as something stranger and more difficult to categorize. He was a self-educated ethnobotanist, a genuinely original thinker, and a lecturer of hypnotic brilliance who spent the 1980s and early 1990s travelling the underground circuit of alternative conferences, bookshops, and early internet forums, developing a philosophy of psychedelics that was simultaneously rigorous and completely unhinged in the most productive possible way. McKenna's central argument was that psilocybin mushrooms were not simply a drug, not a chemical that produced effects the way aspirin produces pain relief. He proposed that the mushroom was, in some sense that he acknowledged he could not scientifically prove, a form of intelligence. He pointed to the extraordinary complexity of psilocybin experiences, their consistent themes across cultures, their apparent ability to generate information that subjects reported as genuinely novel rather than merely recombined from existing memories, and argued that this required explanation beyond simple receptor pharmacology. His audiences found this either profound or delusional, often simultaneously. What McKenna did practically, beyond the cultivation manual, was normalize the idea of psilocybin as something worthy of serious intellectual engagement rather than mere hedonistic pursuit. He drew connections between mushroom experiences and the shamanic traditions documented in anthropological literature, between psilocybin neuropharmacology and information theory, between the phenomenology of high-dose mushroom experiences and the descriptions of mystical states in every major religious tradition. He was not always right. He was almost always interesting. While McKenna was building the intellectual scaffolding of the underground, something equally important was happening in the mountains of Oaxaca, though this part of the story moved in the opposite direction, toward loss rather than expansion. The flood of foreign visitors that Wasson's 1957 article had initiated never fully stopped. Through the 1970s and 1980s, a steady stream of seekers made the journey to Huautla de Jimenez, drawn by stories of Maria Sabina and the original ceremonies she represented. Some came with genuine respect. Many came with the assumption that indigenous knowledge was a free resource available for personal extraction. The result was a slow, grinding disruption of the ceremonial traditions that had survived 4 centuries of colonial suppression, not through violence this time, but through cultural appropriation so thorough and so continuous that it amounted to the same thing by different means. Maria Sabina died in 1985, in poverty, in the village she had never left. Her funeral was attended by locals and a small number of the foreign researchers who had built careers partly on the knowledge she had shared. The ceremony she had practiced continued after her death, carried by other healers in other villages, but the tradition had been altered irrevocably by 4 decades of outside contact. What had been a living, community-embedded healing practice was increasingly being performed for and defined by outsiders, a dynamic that would accelerate dramatically in the decades that followed. Meanwhile, in the legal grey areas of Europe, something else was shifting. The Netherlands had never specifically prohibited psilocybe mushrooms themselves, only synthesized psilocybin as a chemical compound. This technical oversight created a situation where magic mushroom shops operated openly in Amsterdam throughout the 1990s, selling fresh mushrooms legally to tourists and locals alike. The Dutch government eventually closed this loophole in 2008, banning fresh mushrooms, but crucially missing another loophole in the process. Psilocybin truffles, the underground storage organs of the same fungal species containing identical compounds, were not covered by the ban because they were classified as a different part of the organism. The truffle loophole is not a minor footnote. It is the legal foundation on which a multi-million-dollar Dutch retreat industry would later be built, and one of the stranger examples in legal history of a government accidentally preserving the very substance it was trying to eliminate by drawing its prohibition line in the wrong place. By the mid-1990s, the underground had reached a kind of stable equilibrium. Psilocybin mushrooms were illegal in most of the world, widely available in most of the world, cultivated by a dispersed global community of enthusiasts, consumed by millions of people annually, and studied by essentially nobody with institutional funding or scientific credentials. The knowledge base was enormous but entirely informal, accumulated through personal experience, underground literature, and early internet forums rather than peer-reviewed research. Something was building, invisible to official channels, in the gap between what the law said and what people were actually doing. The question was what would happen when that gap became impossible to ignore. The answer arrived from the last place anyone expected: a carefully designed clinical study published in a mainstream scientific journal by a researcher at one of the most prestigious medical institutions in the United States, describing results so extraordinary that even the researchers who produced them weren't entirely sure what to do with what they had found. Before the science can be understood, one number needs to land properly: 1958. That is the year Albert Hofmann, the Swiss chemist who had already given the world LSD by accident in 1943, isolated psilocybin from samples obtained through Wasson's Oaxacan connections and published its molecular structure. The compound was simple enough to synthesize cleanly, stable enough to store reliably, and chemically similar enough to serotonin that Hofmann immediately understood it was doing something specific and targeted inside the brain rather than producing a broad, blunt neurological disruption. He knew it was important. He had no idea how important. The molecule itself is almost insultingly small. Psilocybin, 4-phosphoryloxy-N, dimethyltryptamine, is a tryptamine, meaning it belongs to the same chemical family as serotonin, melatonin, and DMT. The body converts psilocybin to psilocin almost immediately after ingestion, and psilocin is the compound that actually does the work. What it does, at the most basic pharmacological level, is bind to serotonin receptors, specifically the 5-HT2A subtype, which is distributed densely across the brain's cortex. This binding triggers a cascade of neural activity so complex and so widespread that neuroscientists spent decades arguing about how to even describe it accurately. The description that finally stuck came from neuroimaging technology that didn't exist when Hofmann first isolated the compound. Functional MRI and magnetoencephalography, brain scanning tools that can show which regions are active in real time, allowed researchers in the 2000s to watch what psilocybin actually did to a living brain, in high resolution, with enough subjects to draw statistically meaningful conclusions. What they saw was not what anyone had predicted. The expected finding was increased brain activity, a stimulated, overdriven system producing hallucinations through excess. The actual finding was almost the opposite. Certain key brain regions showed dramatically reduced activity under psilocybin. The region showing the most consistent suppression was the default mode network. The default mode network is not a single structure but a collection of interconnected regions, primarily the medial prefrontal cortex, the posterior cingulate cortex, and the angular gyrus, that activate together during a specific type of mental activity. That activity is self-referential thought. The DMN is most active when a person is not focused on any external task, but is instead thinking about themselves, ruminating about the past, worrying about the future, constructing and maintaining the narrative of personal identity. It is, in the bluntest possible terms, the part of the brain that generates the experience of being a self. Neuroscientists call it the ego machine, and psilocybin turns it off, not permanently, not dangerously, but with a completeness and consistency that, when researchers first saw the imaging data clearly, produced a specific kind of scientific silence, the silence of people looking at something they had suspected might be true, but had not expected to see confirmed so unambiguously on a screen. Imperial College London's Robin Carhart Harris published the first high-quality neuroimaging study of psilocybin's effects in 2012, and the data showed something with an additional layer of strangeness beyond the DMN suppression. As the default mode network went quiet, other brain regions that did not normally communicate with each other began forming massive temporary connections. Visual processing areas link directly to regions governing memory and emotion. Language areas connected to sensory cortices. The brain, under psilocybin, was operating with a dramatically increased level of what Carhart-Harris termed entropy, a measure of the randomness and diversity of neural communication patterns. The brain became, briefly, a much more connected, much less hierarchically organized system. This pattern had been observed in one other context in existing neuroscience literature: advanced meditators in states of deep practice. Experienced meditators who had spent decades developing the capacity to quiet the default mode network showed similar cross-regional connectivity patterns during deep states. Psilocybin produced the same neurological signature in 4 hours that some contemplative practitioners spent lifetimes developing. The monks reading this data in Tibetan monasteries were reportedly not amused. What people actually experienced during this neurological reorganization was the more complicated part, because subjective experience is not cleanly reducible to brain scan data, and the gap between what the imaging showed and what subjects reported was itself a subject of intense scientific debate. The most consistent reported experience was what researchers carefully termed ego dissolution, and what subjects reaching for ordinary language to describe something ordinary language wasn't built for, described as the complete disappearance of the sense of being a separate person. Not unconsciousness, not sleep. Something closer to the opposite, a state of heightened awareness in which the boundary between self and world dissolved entirely, leaving pure perception without a perceiver. Some subjects found this terrifying. Others found it the most profound relief they had ever experienced, as if a weight they hadn't known they were carrying had been lifted completely. The experiences didn't stop at neurological novelty. They had measurable, lasting consequences. Subjects who reported ego dissolution and mystical experiences during psilocybin sessions showed persistent changes in a personality trait called openness to experience, one of the 5 major dimensions in mainstream personality psychology, associated with curiosity, aesthetic sensitivity, and tolerance for ambiguity. Personality traits in adults are considered extremely stable. Most research suggests they barely change over decades of ordinary life. A single psilocybin session produced changes in openness that persisted for at least a year in multiple studies, the largest changes in personality ever recorded in a controlled psychological experiment. This finding created a specific problem for the scientific consensus on how minds change, because the consensus said they mostly didn't, not quickly, not permanently, not from a single experience. Psilocybin was producing in 4 hours the kind of psychological transformation that therapists working with conventional methods hope to achieve over years. The mechanism appeared to involve not just the DMN suppression, but what happened during the period of reconnection afterward. As the default mode network rebooted, it appeared to do so with altered connectivity patterns, as if the temporary disruption had allowed the brain to establish new default configurations. The metaphor that Carhart-Harris eventually offered was of a snow globe. The ordinary brain was a snow globe in which the snow had settled into fixed patterns at the bottom, habitual thought patterns, entrenched emotional responses, rigid self-narratives that determined how every new experience was processed. Psilocybin shook the globe. During the session, everything was in suspension. During the period of reintegration that followed, the snow settled again, but not necessarily into the same patterns. If the reintegration was supported by appropriate therapy and intention, it could settle into configurations that were healthier, more flexible, more adaptive. The clinical implications of this model were not subtle. If the brain's most pathological states, depression, addiction, OCD, PTSD, were characterized by rigidly entrenched patterns of thought and self-narrative, and if psilocybin could genuinely disrupt those patterns at the neurological level, then the therapeutic potential was not merely interesting. It was potentially revolutionary in a field that had not seen a genuinely new mechanism of psychiatric treatment since the introduction of SSRIs in the 1980s. What psilocybin was doing neurologically had a name in the research literature by the late 2000s. It was acting as a psychoplastogen, a compound that promoted neuroplasticity, the brain's capacity to form new connections and reorganize existing ones. Subsequent research found that psilocybin actually stimulated the growth of new dendritic spines, the physical connection points between neurons, in animal models, with effects observable under microscopes, not just in behavioral data. The brain was not just functionally reorganizing, it was physically rebuilding itself. All of this knowledge existed in published peer-reviewed scientific literature. It had been generated through legitimate research funded by legitimate institutions, and it created a pressure that the regulatory framework of Schedule I classification was increasingly struggling to contain, because the data being produced was not ambiguous. It was not preliminary. It was not produced by enthusiasts looking for confirmation of their prior beliefs. It was produced by skeptical scientists who had gone into their studies expecting to find modest marginal effects, and had instead found something that kept refusing to be modest or marginal, no matter how carefully they designed their controls. The snow globe, it turned out, had been waiting a very long time to be shaken. Roland Griffiths did not look like a revolutionary. He was a behavioral pharmacologist at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, one of the most respected medical institutions on Earth, with 30 years of careful, methodologically rigorous research on mood-altering substances, primarily caffeine and benzodiazepines. His publication record was long and respected and almost aggressively uncontroversial. He wore the professional armour of a man who had spent a career building credibility inside an institution that guarded its reputation with institutional ferocity. When he proposed a study giving psilocybin to healthy volunteers in 1999, his colleagues did not immediately celebrate his vision. Several of them thought he had lost his mind. The regulatory pathway alone took years. Schedule 1 classification meant that every gram of psilocybin used in research had to be synthesized under DEA license, stored in a DEA-approved vault, transported under specific security protocols, and accounted for with a precision normally associated with weapons-grade materials. The paperwork required to give a volunteer a capsule of psilocybin in a clinical setting was approximately equivalent to the paperwork required to run a small nuclear facility. Griffiths navigated this without complaint because he had seen enough preliminary data to believe the effort was justified, and because he was, at his core, a scientist who trusted well-designed experiments over institutional consensus. The study that emerged from this process was published in the journal Psychopharmacology in 2006, and it was designed with a conservatism that bordered on the ceremonial, every detail calibrated to preempt the objections of skeptics who would be looking for any methodological weakness to exploit. 36 volunteers, carefully screened to exclude anyone with personal or family history of psychosis or major mental illness. Comfortable, well-furnished rooms rather than clinical settings. Trained guides present throughout each session. A double-blind crossover design comparing psilocybin against an active placebo, methylphenidate, a stimulant with no psychedelic properties, so that neither volunteers nor guides knew which substance had been administered on a given day. The doses were high. Griffiths was not interested in subperceptual effects or gentle introductions. He gave volunteers 30 milligrams of psilocybin per 70 kilograms of body weight, enough to produce profound alterations in consciousness in virtually every subject. He wanted to study the full experience, not a diluted version of it. The results, when they came, were so consistent and so striking that Griffith spent months checking and rechecking his data before submitting the paper, concerned that results this clean would be dismissed as too good to be credible. 67% of volunteers rated the psilocybin session as one of the 5 most meaningful experiences of their entire lives. 33% rated it as the single most meaningful experience, in the same category as the birth of a child, a profound religious conversion, or the death of a parent. These ratings were not collected immediately after the session, when subjects might have been in an afterglow state of uncritical enthusiasm. They were collected 2 months later, after the neuropharmacological effect had long dissipated and ordinary cognitive functioning had fully returned. The volunteers were reflecting on the experience from the same psychological distance with which they reflected on other major life events, and they were placing it at the apex. The scientific community's response was not uniformly enthusiastic. Several prominent researchers argued that the study lacked controls for expectancy effects. Volunteers knew they might receive psilocybin and might have generated meaningful experiences partly through expectation. Others pointed to the small sample size. The New York Times covered the study with a mixture of genuine interest and reflexive caution, quoting critics alongside Griffiths in a way that accurately reflected institutional ambivalence. What the critics could not explain away was the follow-up data. 14 months after the original sessions, over 80% of volunteers reported that the psilocybin experience had produced lasting positive changes in their attitudes about life, their sense of personal well-being, and their relationships with others. These self-reports were corroborated by independent ratings from family members and colleagues who knew the volunteers well, people who had no investment in the study's outcome and who confirmed, without prompting, that the volunteers seemed genuinely, measurably different in ways they could identify, but not always articulate. The Griffiths paper cracked open a door that Schedule 1 classification had sealed for 36 years. Within months, other researchers began submitting protocols for psilocybin studies. The FDA, whose job is to evaluate evidence rather than ideology, began reviewing applications with a seriousness that would have been unimaginable a decade earlier. What followed was not a single breakthrough, but an avalanche of them, each study landing with more force than the last. At NYU, researchers gave psilocybin to cancer patients experiencing severe anxiety and depression related to their diagnoses, people confronting death with the particular terror of those who feel they are running out of time to make peace with it. The results were published in 2016, simultaneously with a second study from Johns Hopkins on the same population. Together, the two studies enrolled 80 patients and produced effect sizes that made the numbers almost uncomfortable to read. 80% of participants showed clinically significant reductions in depression and anxiety. 60% showed complete remission of anxiety symptoms. These effects were measured not at 1 week or 1 month, but at 6 months following a single session. A single session. The standard pharmacological treatment for the same conditions, SSR is combined with anxiolytics, produced remission rates closer to 40%, required daily administration, and stopped working the moment the pill stopped. The oncology patients did not simply become less afraid. Several described something more fundamental, not a reduction of the fear of death, but a complete restructuring of their relationship to the fact of dying. They described understanding, in a way that felt embodied rather than merely intellectual, that their sense of self was not identical to their biological existence, that the thing they were most afraid of losing was not, perhaps, the thing they had believed it to be. Psychiatrists reading these accounts recognized the description immediately. It was the phenomenology of ego dissolution applied to terminal illness. The psilocybin was not numbing the pain. It was dissolving the psychological architecture within which the pain had its most devastating grip. Addiction research produced equally startling data. Matthew Johnson at Johns Hopkins designed studies giving psilocybin to long-term smokers who had failed multiple cessation attempts, people who had tried patches, gum, Chantix, hypnotherapy, and behavioral counseling without success. After 2 to 3 psilocybin sessions combined with cognitive behavioral therapy, 80% of participants were abstinent at 6-month follow-up. 80%. The best available pharmaceutical treatment for smoking cessation, varenicline, produced 35% abstinence at the same interval. A separate study on alcohol use disorder showed comparable results. The mechanism appeared to involve exactly what the neuroimaging data predicted. The psilocybin sessions disrupted the entrenched self-narrative. I am a smoker. I need this drink. With sufficient force that the narrative couldn't fully reconstitute itself in its original form. Treatment-resistant depression was perhaps the most consequential application, because treatment-resistant depression is both extraordinarily common and extraordinarily devastating. Roughly 30% of people with major depressive disorder do not respond adequately to available antidepressants. They cycle through medications, adjust doses, add augmentation agents, and remain depressed, sometimes for decades. Imperial College London's Carhart-Harris ran the first open-label study of psilocybin in this population in 2016, enrolling 20 patients who had been depressed for an average of 17 years and had failed an average of 4 prior treatments. After 2 psilocybin sessions, 12 of 20 showed significant clinical response. 7 achieved complete remission. The effects persisted at 3-month follow-up in the majority of responders. Carhart-Harris was careful to note the limitations: no control group, small sample, open-label design. but the effect sizes were large enough that the limitations didn't change the fundamental message. Something was happening here that conventional psychiatry had no mechanism to produce, the FDA noticed. In 2018, psilocybin-assisted therapy for treatment-resistant depression received Breakthrough Therapy designation, a regulatory category created to accelerate the development of treatments for serious conditions where preliminary evidence suggests substantial improvement over existing options. This was not a legalization. It was not even close to a legalization. But it was the FDA formally acknowledging for the first time since 1970 that psilocybin might be medicine rather than merely a controlled substance. The designation changed the calculation for pharmaceutical companies, research institutions, and investors simultaneously. Money began flowing into psilocybin research with a speed that reflected not altruism, but the recognition that the patent landscape for a genuinely effective treatment for depression, the most economically burdensome mental illness on Earth, affecting over 280 million people globally, represented a market opportunity of extraordinary scale. The science had returned, and it had brought money with it, which meant it was not going away again. What nobody fully anticipated was that while academic researchers were carefully documenting psilocybin's therapeutic potential in controlled clinical settings, a completely parallel revolution was already well underway, not in hospitals or laboratories, but in the glass-walled offices of San Francisco technology companies, where people were taking tiny amounts of the same compound and reporting that it was making them better at their jobs. The year was 2015, and in a glass and steel office building in San Francisco's Soma district, a software engineer was preparing for a product review meeting by doing something that would have gotten him arrested in 49 states. He was measuring out roughly 1/10 of a gram of dried psilocybin mushrooms, an amount so small it fit easily on the tip of a teaspoon, grinding them into powder and placing them in a capsule that looked identical to the vitamin D supplements his colleagues took at their standing desks. He wasn't trying to hallucinate. He wasn't trying to find God. He was trying to hit his sprint deadline without burning out by Wednesday. This was microdosing, and it was already everywhere. The practice had existed in the underground since the 1970s, whispered about in the same communities that had read the McKenna cultivation manual and traded spores through the mail. But it had no name, no protocol, no public framework, and no critical mass of practitioners willing to discuss it openly. What changed that was a combination of three forces arriving simultaneously: the maturation of Silicon Valley's productivity obsession, the anonymity of Reddit, and the publication in 2011 of a book by a psychologist named James Fadiman called The Psychedelic Explorer's Guide. Fadiman was not a counterculture figure in the Leary mold. He was a Stanford-educated researcher who had conducted legitimate psychedelic research in the 1960s before Prohibition shut it down, and who had spent the subsequent decades quietly collecting reports from people who used psychedelics outside clinical settings. The chapter on microdosing in his book was brief, almost an afterthought, but it described a specific protocol: 1 day on, 2 days off, doses of approximately 10 micrograms of LSD or the equivalent in psilocybin, with careful journaling of effects. The protocol gave the practice a structure it had previously lacked. Structure made it transmissible. The transmission vector was Reddit. A forum called r/microdosing appeared in 2013 and grew with a speed that reflected genuine demand rather than manufactured enthusiasm. Within 2 years, it had tens of thousands of subscribers exchanging dosing protocols, reporting effects, and troubleshooting problems with the methodical seriousness of people optimizing a software system. The language used on the forum was revealing. Practitioners described microdosing not in terms of altered consciousness or spiritual experience, but in terms of workflow optimization, emotional regulation, and cognitive performance metrics. The vocabulary was entirely Silicon Valley, /B testing applied to brain states. The reported effects clustered around a surprisingly consistent profile: enhanced creative problem-solving, specifically the capacity to make non-obvious connections between disparate concepts, reduced anxiety without sedation, increased empathy and social fluency, sustained focus without the crash associated with stimulants, reduced tendency toward negative rumination, the mental habit of replaying problems and failures that characterizes both ordinary stress and clinical depression. Some users reported that microdosing had replaced their SSRI prescriptions, a substitution they made without medical supervision, and that researchers found simultaneously fascinating and alarming. The tech industry's adoption of microdosing had a specific logic that went beyond individual performance optimization. Silicon Valley's professional culture had by 2015 fully absorbed the mythology of the visionary outsider, the person who saw reality differently from everyone else and built billion-dollar companies out of the gap between their perception and convention. Steve Jobs had famously described his LSD experiences as among the most important of his life. The industry had collectively decided that consciousness alteration and technological innovation were connected, and microdosing slotted into that narrative with the frictionlessness of a perfectly fitted component. What made microdosing culturally explosive was precisely that it wasn't a full psychedelic experience. The terror factor was gone. You didn't need to clear your schedule, find a guide, or prepare yourself psychologically for ego dissolution. You took a capsule with breakfast, went to work, attended your meetings, and reported feeling subtly but meaningfully better at the things you were already doing. It was the pharmacological equivalent of upgrading your operating system. Same hardware, improved performance, no reboot required. By 2016, the practice had migrated well beyond tech workers. A survey conducted by Federman and his collaborator Sophia Korb collected self-reports from nearly 1,500 microdosers across multiple countries and professional backgrounds. The demographics were striking in their breadth. Teachers, artists, parents, nurses, lawyers, and retirees alongside the expected engineers and designers. The most commonly reported reason for starting was not performance enhancement but mental health, specifically managing depression or anxiety that conventional treatment had not adequately addressed. The most commonly reported benefit was not productivity but emotional stability. The compound was being used as a self-managed psychiatric tool by people who had either exhausted conventional options or distrusted conventional systems enough to avoid them entirely. The absence of clinical data for microdosing was a problem that nobody in the mainstream scientific community could ignore indefinitely. Federman's self-report surveys were useful but methodologically weak. There was no control group, no blinding, no standardized outcome measures. People who went looking for benefits tended to find them, a phenomenon psychologists call expectancy effects, and which accounts for a substantial portion of placebo responses in drug trials. The question of whether microdosing's benefits were pharmacological or psychological was not merely academic. It had direct implications for safety, dosing, and the millions of people quietly experimenting on themselves without medical oversight. Imperial College London and several other institutions launched placebo-controlled microdosing studies in the late 2000s. The results, when they arrived, introduced a complication nobody in the microdosing community had fully anticipated. Several well-designed trials found that blinded microdosers, people who didn't know whether they were taking psilocybin or an inactive placebo, showed benefits indistinguishable from placebo in standardized psychological assessments. The self-reported improvements were real, in the sense that subjects genuinely felt better. but the performance improvements on objective cognitive tests failed to materialize consistently. The research did not kill microdosing's popularity. If anything, it intensified the debate, because the studies had a design limitation that practitioners were quick to identify. They ran for 4 to 6 weeks, while many committed microdosers reported that the most significant benefits emerged after 3 to 6 months of consistent practice. Long-term controlled trials were practically and ethically complicated to run with an illegal substance. The scientific conversation was constrained by the same regulatory barriers that had hampered full-dose research for decades. The difference being that microdosing's practitioners numbered in the millions and were not waiting for regulatory permission to continue their experiments. The irony crystallized into something almost perfectly absurd by 2019. A substance that the 1960s counterculture had used specifically to escape the productivity demands of industrial capitalism was being enthusiastically embraced by the most aggressively capitalist subculture on Earth as a tool to produce more output, more efficiently, with less psychological friction. The mushroom that Aztec priests had used to communicate with gods was being used by product managers to improve their sprint velocity. Maria Sabina had conducted healing ceremonies by candlelight in a mountain village with no electricity. Her pharmacological descendant was being measured into capsules in apartments where every other surface displayed a glowing Apple logo. Whether this represented progress, corruption, or simply the unstoppable adaptability of a compound that had been finding new hosts for 9,000 years depended entirely on who was asked and in which century they were metaphorically standing. What was unambiguous was the scale. By 2020, conservative estimates placed the number of people who had tried microdosing at over 2 million in the United States alone. The practice had been covered approvingly by the BBC, Forbes, Rolling Stone, and The New Yorker. It had generated a small industry of books, apps, online courses, and subscription microdosing services operating in legal grey areas across multiple jurisdictions. The mushroom was no longer underground in any meaningful sense. It was on the covers of magazines, discussed at dinner parties, and referenced casually in mainstream workplace conversations. The political consequences of this normalization were already accumulating, quietly and steadily, in the legislative offices of several American cities where advocates were preparing ballot initiatives that would have been unimaginable a decade earlier, and that were about to succeed in ways that would force the entire legal architecture of drug prohibition to reckon with a question it had been avoiding for 50 years. The campaign to decriminalize psilocybin in Denver, Colorado, did not begin in a government office, a law firm, or a university research department. It began in the living room of a man named Kevin Matthews, a former Army cadet who had left military training due to severe depression, spent years cycling through medications that didn't work, and eventually used psilocybin mushrooms in an unsupervised setting that he later described as the turning point of his psychological life. Matthews was not a politician. He was not a lawyer. He was someone who believed the substance that had helped him should not be a criminal matter, and he was willing to do the unglamorous administrative work required to put that belief on a ballot. The Denver Psilocybin Mushroom Decriminalization Initiative, Initiative 301, qualified for the May 2019 ballot after a grassroots signature-gathering campaign that collected the required number of names with almost no institutional backing and a budget that would not have covered a single week of television advertising for a conventional political campaign. The opposition was similarly informal. No major anti-drug organizations mounted a serious counter-campaign, partly because nobody in the establishment took the initiative seriously enough to bother defeating it. It passed by 50.6%, a margin of 2,000 votes. The narrowness of the victory was almost immediately irrelevant, because the significance was not in the margin, but in the precedent. Denver had become the first city in the United States to decriminalize psilocybin mushrooms, and the news traveled through every channel simultaneously: mainstream media, Reddit forums, academic listservs, and the international network of psychedelic researchers who had been watching American drug policy with the frustrated attention of people waiting for a traffic jam to clear for 30 years. The dam had not broken, but a crack had appeared that everyone could see. Oakland moved faster and further. 6 weeks after Denver's vote, the Oakland City Council passed a resolution decriminalizing not just psilocybin, but all naturally occurring psychedelic plants and fungi, a category that included peyote, ayahuasca, and ibogaine, alongside mushrooms. The vote was unanimous. The language was explicit. Possession, use, and cultivation of these substances by adults would be among the lowest law enforcement priorities in the city. The political logic driving Oakland was different from Denver's, less focused on individual therapeutic benefit and more grounded in racial justice arguments, specifically the disproportionate impact of drug enforcement on communities of color. The mushroom had acquired a new political constituency it hadn't previously had. What was happening legislatively was inseparable from what was happening culturally. The population of Americans who had personal experience with psilocybin had grown steadily since the underground cultivation revolution of the 1970s, and by 2019 it included a significant number of people in positions of civic and institutional authority: city council members, state legislators, physicians, judges, and veterans advocates who could speak about the substance from direct experience rather than theoretical concern. The just say no political framework had been built on the assumption that drug use was something that happened to other people, in other neighborhoods, and that the people making drug policy had no personal stake in its consequences. That assumption was increasingly false, and increasingly obviously false. Oregon's Measure 109 was a different order of magnitude entirely. Where Denver had decriminalized and Oakland had followed, Oregon in November 2020 passed a ballot measure creating the first regulatory framework in American history for supervised therapeutic use of psilocybin, not decriminalization, but a pathway toward legal, licensed, professionally facilitated psilocybin services available to any adult resident of the state. The measure passed with 56% of the vote, during a presidential election in which Oregon also voted overwhelmingly Democratic. But the psilocybin measure drew support from across the political spectrum in a way that suggested its appeal was not purely ideological. The implementation was deliberately slow. Oregon's health authority spent 2 years developing licensing requirements, training standards, and facility regulations before the first legal psilocybin service centers opened in 2023. The caution was deliberate. Regulators were acutely aware that a single high-profile adverse event could set the entire movement back by decades, and they designed the system with the conservatism of people who understood they were building infrastructure that would either validate or discredit every clinical study and political argument that had preceded it. The veterans' lobby proved to be one of the most politically potent forces driving decriminalization across multiple states. PTSD affected roughly 20% of combat veterans from the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, a population of hundreds of thousands of people for whom existing treatments provided inadequate relief. The suicide rate among veterans had been running at 20 deaths per day for years, a statistic that appeared in congressional testimony with the frequency and impact of a recurring nightmare. Veterans organizations that had examined the Johns Hopkins and NYU data on psilocybin and PTSD were not asking for recreational access. They were asking for their members' lives, and they were asking with the moral authority that American political culture extends to people who have served in combat. politicians who had reflexively opposed any loosening of drug restrictions found it considerably harder to maintain that position when a decorated veteran was explaining in plain language that a mushroom had done what 3 years of VA psychiatry had not. Texas, not a state associated with psychedelic progressivism, passed legislation in 2021 requiring the state health department to study psilocybin's efficacy for PTSD and depression. The bill was authored by a Republican and co-sponsored by members of both parties. The political landscape had shifted so completely and so quickly that the shift itself became newsworthy. Journalists who had covered drug policy for decades were openly describing the change as unlike anything they had observed in 30 years of watching the war on drugs operate as a political constant. The international dimension accelerated the American timeline rather than following it. Canada's federal health minister began granting individual exemptions, allowing terminal patients to use psilocybin for end-of-life distress in 2020. The Netherlands truffle market, that legislative accident from 2008, had by this point generated a substantial industry of retreat centres that had been quietly running for a decade, accumulating operational experience and safety data that no American institution could legally generate. Israel had approved psilocybin-assisted therapy trials with remarkable speed, partly because its military medical establishment had developed an acute institutional interest in PTSD treatments that actually worked. Australia moved most decisively of all. In February 2023, the Therapeutic Goods Administration, Australia's equivalent of the FDA, announced that MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD and psilocybin-assisted therapy for treatment-resistant depression would be reclassified from prohibited substances to controlled medicines, effective July 1, 2023. Authorized psychiatrists could prescribe both substances within a regulated therapeutic framework. Australia had not merely decriminalized or created research exemptions, it had made psilocybin medicine, legally, nationally, with a regulatory infrastructure requiring prescribers to be specially trained and sessions to be conducted in approved clinical settings. The announcement sent a specific kind of shock through the international research community. Not surprise exactly, because Australia had been moving in this direction for several years, but a recognition that the threshold had been crossed. One developed nation with a sophisticated regulatory apparatus had looked at the accumulated clinical evidence and concluded it was sufficient. The question for every other country was no longer whether psilocybin-assisted therapy would eventually be legal somewhere. It already was. The question was how long each jurisdiction would take to follow. The pharmaceutical industry had been watching all of this with the calculating attention of entities whose entire existence depends on correctly anticipating which direction markets are moving. Patents on most SSRI medications had expired or were expiring. The antidepressant market was enormous, worth over $14 billion annually in the United States alone, and largely stagnant, flooded with generic medications that worked for some patients and failed many others. Psilocybin represented something the pharmaceutical industry had not seen in psychiatry for decades. A genuinely novel mechanism with clinical data suggesting it could reach patients that existing treatments couldn't. The money flowing into psilocybin research by 2022 was not counterculture money. It was venture capital, pharmaceutical investment, and institutional funding operating with the cold precision of entities that ran financial models rather than mushroom ceremonies. Compass Pathways had raised over $200 million. Usona Institute was running Phase 3 trials. The economic infrastructure of psychedelic medicine was being built with a speed and scale that bore no resemblance to the grassroots underground of the McKenna era. The mushroom that had spent 400 years hiding in the mountains of Oaxaca, 50 years hiding in mason jars in suburban kitchens, was now hiding in plain sight, in clinical trial databases, investment portfolios, and legislative calendars, waiting for the final set of doors to open that would make its journey from cave painting to pharmacy counter complete. The first thing a prospective guest saw when landing on the website of a typical psilocybin retreat center in 2022 was not a medical disclaimer or a list of contraindications. It was a photograph. Invariably the same photograph, executed with minor variations. A person sitting cross-legged in a forest clearing, eyes closed, face tilted upward toward light filtering through trees, expression calibrated to convey the precise emotional register of profound peace discovered at considerable personal expense. The retreat cost between $3,000 and $8,000 for a weekend. It was fully booked 6 months in advance. The waiting list had a waiting list. The retreat industry had not appeared suddenly. It had been quietly assembling itself for years in the jurisdictions where psilocybin existed in legal grey areas, primarily the Netherlands, Jamaica, Mexico, Costa Rica, and the Cayman Islands, each location chosen for a specific regulatory reason. The Netherlands had its truffle loophole. Jamaica had never specifically criminalized psilocybin mushrooms, an oversight in its colonial-era drug legislation that nobody had bothered to correct, and that now constituted the legal foundation of a thriving industry. Mexico's legal status was similarly ambiguous regarding traditional ceremonial use. Costa Rica had no law specifically addressing psilocybin, placing it in a category its operators described, with varying degrees of accuracy, as not illegal. The clientele arriving at these centres shared certain demographic characteristics with remarkable consistency. They were predominantly white, predominantly affluent, predominantly from the United States, Canada, Western Europe, and Australia. The average age was rising. By the early 2000s, a significant proportion of retreat guests were in their 40s and 50s, people who had built successful professional lives and found themselves, at the peak of those lives, unexpectedly empty. They were not, for the most part, seeking recreational experience. They were seeking something the clinical language of psychiatry didn't quite have a word for: a recalibration of meaning, a confrontation with accumulated psychological debt, a way through grief or anxiety, or the specific flatness that descends on people who have achieved everything they planned to achieve and discovered it wasn't enough. Some of what happened at these centres was genuinely therapeutic. The best of them employed trained psychotherapists, maintained careful medical screening protocols, provided extensive preparation sessions before the ceremony and integration support afterward, and operated with a seriousness of purpose that produced outcomes their guests described in terms that echoed the clinical trial literature almost exactly. The therapeutic architecture, preparation, experience, integration had been developed through decades of underground practice and was being refined continuously through feedback from thousands of participants. But the industry was completely unregulated in most of the jurisdictions where it operated, and the distance between the best centres and the worst was not a matter of degrees, it was a chasm. Reports of sexual abuse by facilitators began appearing in underground forums as early as 2015, then in mainstream media by 2019. The pattern was disturbingly consistent. A facilitator, almost always male, exploiting the profound psychological vulnerability and trust that high-dose psilocybin experiences produced in participants. Ego dissolution, by definition, involves the dissolution of the psychological defenses that ordinarily protect against manipulation. A person in that state is not making informed decisions in any meaningful sense. Several prominent facilitators who had built large followings through social media and word of mouth were publicly accused by multiple participants, and the accusations revealed an industry with no licensing requirements, no reporting mechanisms, no professional oversight body, and no legal framework within which victims could easily seek recourse. Psychological harm was a separate category of concern, less dramatic than sexual abuse but statistically more prevalent. Psilocybin at high doses produces experiences of such intensity that a significant minority of participants, estimated in various surveys at between 10 and 30%, reported acute psychological distress during their sessions. Most resolved within the session itself with skilled facilitation, but some did not. Cases of prolonged anxiety, depersonalization, and in rare instances genuine psychotic breaks were documented in individuals who had either not been adequately screened for pre-existing vulnerabilities or had been inadequately supported during and after their experiences. The clinical trial literature had always emphasized that psilocybin was not pharmacologically dangerous. It was physiologically non-toxic and non-addictive, but that its psychological intensity required careful management. The retreat industry's inconsistent adherence to this principle was producing a casualty rate that advocates of psilocybin were reluctant to publicize, and critics were eager to amplify. The cultural appropriation dimension of the retreat industry was the most complex and the most politically charged. The ceremonies being sold to affluent Westerners were not invented by the retreat industry. They were derived, sometimes loosely, sometimes with more direct connection, from the Aztec healing traditions that had survived 400 years of colonial suppression, specifically because they were embedded in community relationships, transmitted through lineages of trained healers, and calibrated to specific cultural and spiritual contexts that gave them their structure and their safety. Mazatec communities in Oaxaca had watched the commercialization of their ceremonial knowledge with a mixture of anger, grief, and weary recognition. The pattern was familiar. It was the same dynamic that Wasson had initiated in 1957 with his Life article, accelerated and monetized beyond anything the original disruption had produced. Foreign retreat operators were using Mazatec ceremonial elements, specific songs called Jota Chine, or language of the mushroom, ritual objects, ceremonial structures, without attribution, without permission, without compensation, and without the decades of training that gave those elements their meaning and their safety function within the original context. The Mazatec community's response was not passive. Organizations representing traditional healers began publishing formal statements, asserting cultural sovereignty over ceremonial knowledge, demanding that the international psilocybin community acknowledge the origins of the practices it was commercializing, and requesting legal frameworks that would provide indigenous communities with intellectual property protections analogous to those available for pharmaceutical patents. The argument was straightforward. If a pharmaceutical company could patent a synthetic psilocybin formulation and generate billions in revenue, why should the cultural knowledge that had preserved and transmitted psilocybin use for 4 centuries generate nothing for the communities who had paid for that preservation with persecution, poverty, and the destruction of Maria Sabina's life? The question had no clean answer within existing legal frameworks, and the retreat industry's response was largely cosmetic. Land acknowledgements on websites, ceremonial elements attributed with slightly more specificity, token percentages of revenue directed toward vaguely defined indigenous causes. The structural relationship between the people who had the knowledge and the people who had the capital remained unchanged. Meanwhile, a quieter and more intimate form of ceremony was happening far from both the retreat centers and the clinical trials, in living rooms, in forests, in small groups of friends with no commercial infrastructure and no institutional affiliation. The underground ceremonies that had sustained psilocybin used through prohibition had not disappeared as the legal landscape changed. They had, if anything, multiplied, drawing in people who couldn't afford retreats, people who distrusted institutions, people who preferred their experience of the sacred to remain personal and unprofitable. These informal ceremonies were operating in the same legal grey area they always had, but with a social legitimacy they had never previously enjoyed. The clinical research had given participants a vocabulary for what they were doing. The decriminalization wave had reduced enforcement pressure in specific jurisdictions. The media normalization had reduced stigma. People who had been conducting mushroom ceremonies in private for years were finding that they no longer needed to be particularly secretive about it, not because it was legal, but because the cultural consensus about what it meant had shifted so dramatically that the legal status had lost much of its practical force. The gap between what the law said and what society actually thought about psilocybin had become, by 2023, approximately as wide as the gap that had preceded the legalization of cannabis, which suggested to anyone paying attention to how drug policy actually changed in democratic societies that the legal architecture was a lagging indicator rather than a leading one. Society had already made its decision. The legislation was catching up. What nobody had fully resolved, not the retreat industry, not the clinical researchers, not the indigenous communities, not the legislative advocates, was the question that sat beneath all the others like the mycelium network sitting beneath the forest floor. What, exactly, happened to a sacred practice when it became an industry? What was preserved? What was lost? And whether the answer was acceptable depended entirely on what you believed the mushroom was for in the first place. In September 2023, a woman in her late 50s sat in a reclining chair in a licensed psilocybin service center in Portland, Oregon, wearing an eye mask and listening to a carefully curated playlist through noise-cancelling headphones. She had been diagnosed with treatment-resistant depression 14 years earlier. She had tried 6 different antidepressants, 3 courses of cognitive behavioral therapy, 2 rounds of transcranial magnetic stimulation, and 1 course of ketamine infusions. None of it had produced more than temporary relief. Her facilitator, a licensed psilocybin service facilitator trained under Oregon's new regulatory framework, sat quietly in a chair nearby, present but unobtrusive, exactly as the training protocol required. 4 hours later, she removed the eye mask. What she said to her facilitator in the minutes that followed was private. What she reported in her follow-up assessment 6 weeks later was that something had shifted in a way she could feel but not entirely articulate, as if a room in her mind that had been sealed for years had been opened and aired out. Her depression scores had dropped below the clinical threshold for the first time in over a decade. She was one of the first legal psilocybin clients in American history, and she represented in a single data point 9,000 years of the mushroom's journey from a cave painting in the Sahara to a regulated therapeutic session in the Pacific Northwest. The Oregon system's first year of operation was closely watched by regulators in a dozen other states and several foreign governments. The data that emerged was imperfect. Implementation had been slower than anticipated. Licensed facilitators were geographically concentrated in Portland and Eugene, and the cost of sessions remained prohibitively high for most people without substantial disposable income. But the safety record was clean. No serious adverse events were reported in the first year. The facilitator training system was working as designed. The critics who had predicted a public health disaster were confronting the same absence of evidence that had frustrated similar predictions about cannabis legalization. The pharmaceutical pathway was moving on a parallel track with its own distinct momentum. Compass Pathways, a British company that had obtained a patent on a synthetic crystalline form of psilocybin called COMP360, was completing Phase 2 clinical trials for treatment-resistant depression, with results that justified advancing to Phase 3. The patent itself had generated controversy in the psychedelic research community that reached levels of intensity unusual, even for a field accustomed to heated debate. Critics argued that patenting a naturally occurring compound in synthesized form was an attempt to privatize a medicine that had existed in the public domain for millennia, effectively allowing a corporation to claim ownership of a therapeutic tool that Aztec healers had developed and preserved over centuries without compensation. Compass responded that their patent covered a specific crystalline polymorph, a particular physical arrangement of the molecule, rather than psilocybin itself, and that the development of a standardized pharmaceutical-grade formulation required investment that could only be recouped through intellectual property protection. This argument was legally sound and did nothing to reduce the controversy, because the controversy was not fundamentally about the legal merits of the patent. It was about who would control access to psilocybin-assisted therapy once it was approved, at what price, and whether that price would place it beyond reach of the people most likely to need it most. The economics of psilocybin medicine had a structural problem that no amount of clinical enthusiasm could resolve. The therapeutic model that had produced the most extraordinary results in clinical trials was not simply drug administration. It was drug administration embedded within an intensive therapeutic relationship, multiple preparation sessions, a full-day dosing session requiring constant facilitator presence, and multiple integration sessions afterward. The total therapist time required per patient was 8 to 12 hours, an order of magnitude greater than conventional psychiatric treatment. At prevailing therapy rates, the cost per patient exceeded $3,000 even before accounting for the drug itself. Insurance coverage was theoretical in most jurisdictions and entirely absent in many. This created a scenario that researchers and advocates discussed with the specific discomfort of people who could see a problem clearly and had no solution ready. Psilocybin-assisted therapy was potentially the most effective treatment for depression, PTSD, and addiction-related disorders ever documented. It was going to be accessible, initially, primarily to the affluent. The clinical trial populations, predominantly white, educated, financially stable, with the social capital to navigate research enrollment processes, were not representative of the populations carrying the heaviest burden of mental illness. The same compound that had been criminalized in ways that disproportionately harmed communities of color was now being developed commercially in ways that would likely disproportionately benefit communities of wealth. The FDA's timeline for formal approval remained uncertain as of 2024. Breakthrough Therapy designation had accelerated the process, but Phase 3 trials for any psychiatric medication were typically multi-year undertakings, and the unusual nature of psilocybin, a drug whose therapeutic effects appeared inseparable from the context in which it was administered, created regulatory challenges that existing approval frameworks were not designed to handle. The FDA was evaluating not just a molecule but a therapeutic system, and the agency was moving with the institutional caution of an entity that understood it was setting precedents that would define an entire new category of medicine. Neuroscience was simultaneously advancing the basic science at a pace that kept complicating the regulatory picture. Research published in 2023 found that psilocybin stimulated synaptogenesis, the formation of new synaptic connections, in the prefrontal cortex with a rapidity and density that exceeded any previously known non-invasive intervention. The structural changes were observable under electron microscopes within 24 hours of administration and persisted for at least a month in animal models. The implication was that psilocybin was not merely producing a functional reorganization of existing neural architecture, it was building new architecture. The brain after psilocybin was not the same physical object as the brain before psilocybin, a finding that raised profound questions about personhood, consent, and the meaning of therapeutic change that philosophy and medical ethics were only beginning to formulate properly. Indigenous communities had not been passive observers of this scientific and commercial acceleration. The Zydor Church of Entheogenic Plants in Oakland had been operating as a religious organization claiming First Amendment protections for psilocybin use since 2019, drawing on legal precedents established by the Supreme Court's 2006 ruling protecting ayahuasca use by the Unión de Vegetal Church. The Native American Church had spent decades defending its right to use peyote in religious ceremonies, developing legal arguments that were now being adapted and deployed by a growing number of organizations seeking religious exemptions for psilocybin. The intersection of drug law, religious freedom, and indigenous rights was producing litigation that would take years to resolve and would likely require Supreme Court intervention before any stable legal framework emerged. In the mountains of Oaxaca, the Mazatec communities watching all of this had arrived at a position of profound ambivalence. On one hand, the global resurgence of interest in psilocybin had brought economic resources, international attention, and a degree of political leverage to communities that had been marginalized for centuries. On the other hand, the commercialization had accelerated in ways that outpaced any meaningful consultation with or compensation for the communities whose knowledge had made it possible. The ceremonies that young Mazatec healers were now being trained in were simultaneously more internationally visible and more culturally fragile than they had been at any previous point in living memory. Pulled in opposite directions by tourist demand and indigenous preservation efforts that were chronically underfunded relative to the commercial interests they were trying to constrain. The deepest question the psilocybin story raised was not regulatory, economic, or even neuroscientific. It was philosophical, and it had been implicit in the story from its very beginning. From the moment a prehistoric human in the Sahara first ate a mushroom and felt the boundaries of self dissolve, and decided, with whatever cognitive apparatus was available to them, that what had happened was important enough to record on stone. The question was this: what does it mean that a molecule produced by a fungus can, reliably and repeatedly, generate experiences that humans across every culture and every century have described as the most meaningful of their lives? What does it mean that ego dissolution, the temporary erasure of the self, reliably produces lasting increases in compassion, openness, and psychological well-being? What does the therapeutic power of these experiences tell us about the nature of ordinary consciousness, about what we are living inside when we're not under the influence of psilocybin? Neuroscience had a partial answer. The default mode network generates a model of self that is useful for navigating social reality, but that, when it becomes too rigid, becomes the substrate of suffering. Psilocybin disrupts the model. The disruption allows reconstruction. The reconstruction, if supported well, tends toward greater flexibility, greater openness, greater capacity for connection. Mystics across 9,000 years of human history had a different answer that arrived, remarkably, at the same place. The self is a construction. Suffering arises from clinging to it, and temporary dissolution of that construction reveals something more fundamental beneath it, something that most traditions called, for lack of more precise language, love. Whether those two answers were describing the same thing in different vocabularies, or whether one was a complete account and the other a poetic approximation, was a question that psilocybin research had made newly urgent without yet making answerable. The scientists and the mystics were for the first time in centuries looking at the same data from opposite ends of the same telescope. What was certain was the trajectory. The mushroom that prehistoric humans had painted on cave walls that Aztec priests had called the flesh of gods, that Spanish inquisitors had called the flesh of the devil, that the CIA had tried to weaponize, that a banker from New York had accidentally introduced to the modern world, that the US government had criminalized, that underground growers had kept alive in mason jars, that Silicon Valley had optimized for productivity, that clinical researchers had proven could heal minds that nothing else could reach, and that an entire global industry was now racing to commodify. That mushroom was still growing out of the ground, exactly as it always had, indifferent to everything humans had done with it or to it or because of it. It would still be growing long after every clinical trial was complete, every patent was filed, every ballot initiative was decided, and every retreat centre had either perfected its practice or collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. The mycelium network running beneath the forest floor did not care about any of this. It had been here before civilization began, and would be here long after the last human argument about its legal status had been forgotten. The door Wasson opened in 1955 was not just open. It had been taken off its hinges, and what was coming through it now was not the controlled trickle of a research compound being carefully managed by institutions with liability concerns. It was a flood of data, of experience, of commercial interest, of cultural conflict, of genuine healing, and of questions so fundamental that answering them honestly would require rethinking almost everything modern civilization believed about the nature of mind, the sources of suffering, and what it actually means to be well. 9,000 years after the first human painted a mushroom on a rock in the Sahara Desert, the conversation about what that mushroom was and what it meant was louder, stranger, more contested, and more consequential than it had ever been. And it was nowhere near finished.